Welcome to the Online Bodyguard Podcast with host Philip Rindell, CEO and founder of Defuse, a global threat and intelligence consultancy that blends psychology and intelligence to mitigate threats and risks to prominent people and brands.
So hi and welcome to the next edition of the Online Bodyguard. I'm absolutely thrilled today because I finally managed to get a gentleman on the call who I have been interacting on and off with for some time around actually getting his advice and getting his contacts and what have you to help Defuse with some of our work. But I'm thrilled to have him on the line today and on the call today, and that's Mr. Totti Karpela. Hi, Totti. How are you?
Hello.
So listen,
I'm very well, thanks.
We share a kind of passion around this subject, and we share a background in that we both come through the policing, well, in fact, actually the military and then the policing history. But of course, you've been doing this a great deal longer than I have. So give us a snapshot of your background and how you've got to where you are today.
Okay. So as you mentioned, I do have a background in the military, like I think most Finnish men do. So I'm a senior sergeant with the Finnish Army Reserves, military police. I started in the National Police in 1989. Yeah, 1989. And I worked with the National Police of Finland for 20 years. Quite early on in my career, I was heavily involved with outlaw bikers. And one thing leads to another. And myself and my family started to get threats. Now, this is early 1990s. Unfortunately, the National Police of Finland didn't have a clue what is threat assessment or threat management. And my name was discovered on a hit list in a maximum security prison, and we had confidential informants telling that there were two individuals who had contracts to kill me and possibly my partner. And so it was quite interesting experience, and in all honesty, quite helpful later on when you are working with victims, because you really can associate with their feelings and anxieties and fears. So in mid-90s, I started to call around and see, with my supervisor's approval, to see what is available. And one thing leads to another. I end up meeting people with LAPD Threat Management Unit. That leads me into the AETAP in 1998. And from there, trainings with the FBI, with Secret Service. And in 2005, Dr. Lorraine Sheridan and Dr. Jens Hoffman, just to name a few, very good friends, we formed the European Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. I got out of the police in 2008, so I've been working as a private consultant ever since. And I was also involved in starting the Asia Pacific Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. And so here I am, many years later, and hopefully with some more knowledge and experience to share.
Well, that's fascinating because, interestingly, one of my first ever homicide investigations I was in involved the outlaw motorcycle group in the UK, between them and the Hells Angels. And it was, it was interesting how we had no concept around the threat they posed. We actually got a guy from Canada, from the Canadian Mounted Police, that came over that gave us some kind of advice and guidance around patches and how they intimidate. But it was fascinating. So you've been doing this for a long time. Why? What's the passion? What drives you? What's the interest around this particular subject?
Well, I've always been interested on the big question of why. If it's impulsive violence, I think it is fascinating, but it's kind of a more simplified issue. So typically, and I'm making very big lines now and making simplified groups, but with impulsive violence, usually you have individuals with limited skills to deal with their own emotional reaction on or solve problems, and that they also accept the use of violence. But there's no fantasy, there's no mystery. at least from my perspective. But when you look at predatory violence or targeted violence, I think any form of predatory violence, workplace violence, I mean bullying or stalking or terrorism or severe cases of domestic violence, a lot of the perpetrators are fully aware what they're doing, and yet they still make that decision of behaving the way that they do. And I just find that really, really interesting, but also from the protective side, I find it a tremendous challenge for the reasons that I just listed. So it is fascinating. And another reason is also that, unfortunately, even today, victims are very, very much left alone. If you turn to the police, or if you turn to your employer or your county, city, wherever, there's still not too much expertise that would really help the victim to deal with the emotional impact and make their lives safer.
Mm-hmm. So over this period then, 30 years of working in this environment and becoming, undoubtedly one of Europe's experts in this subject, what's changed?
Well, I think one of the big things that have changed is legislation. 30 years ago, very, very few countries in Europe, and I'm guessing no countries or very few countries in Asia had legislation to actually deal with this type of crime or behavior. So legislation is one. And I have to say, awareness of targeted violence and targeted violence prevention has started to spread. Unfortunately, probably because of various forms of terrorism. So not perhaps because something that I like to remind that statistically, number-wise, the biggest crime is still domestic violence. But I guess terrorism and school shooters and other similar acts have created an interest for various organizations and professionals to seek out and gain more information and knowledge. And the third one is definitely something, and I think that's probably one of the reasons how we met, is nowadays we have finally reached at least some sort of global network. So we share information from one continent to another, and thanks to various associations, TAPs, you usually have someone that you can call. Either you have an issue with the victim or with the perpetrator, or you need more information on what are the laws and procedures in your country. So those three would be the biggest changes.
So when we look at this subject around targeted and predatory violence, it appears to some people that it's an American issue. We don't have school shootings, we don't have spray killings, we don't have all these sort of things. But we do have celebrities that are stalked. We do have politicians that are targeted. We've had, a politician, or the second politician, murdered in the last 5 years. How are we convincing industry that this is something that they need to be aware of and listen to and get involved with?
Oh, wow. That's a wonderful question. I think one of the things that I have encountered, especially in Southeast Asia, is if we start to talk about school shooters, or if we look at global companies where they have active shooter prevention or response policies, I think many people in their minds, when you talk about shooting, they say, well, that's an American thing. Whereas looking at incidents that we've had in Southeast Asia, you do have similar acts, but they are rarely done with a firearm. It's a meat cleaver, a machete, or a vehicle, or EODs, or something similar. And I slightly disagree with you on we don't have school shooters. I mean, we do have school shooters in various countries in Europe. Unfortunately, Germany and Finland being, I guess, statistically quite high on the European rankings with this one. But I think one of the mindsets is it's low probability, and forgetting that, yes, it might be low probability, but it's high impact. So maybe it's a sort of a bias towards the events. We don't have it. Denial.
Yeah, because it tends to be, certainly a lot about crisis, or we'll come to you when there's a crisis, but less about prevention. I think the kind of understanding of the benefits of this type of work is around managing crises rather than let's get ahead of the game and prevent those events happening.
Yeah, and I think I was just doing a presentation yesterday to a company here in Finland, and we were talking about workplace bullying and counterproductive work behavior. And these were all team leaders, directors, supervisors. So they were all in supervisory position. And we spent 4 hours together. And I think the overall consensus of the group was that they are getting more and more reports nowadays because there's awareness, and we have started to put labels to the behavior that previously we just tolerated, but now we're saying, well, that's counterproductive work behavior, and we don't that's not accepted in our organization. Just before COVID, I was doing a workshop for a group of global regional directors for a big American company, and after the workshop, we're headed out for dinner, and the occupational safe and healthy director for Europe, Middle East, and Asia is walking with me to the restaurant, and he says, "I think your presentation was complete waste of time." And I said, "Well, I appreciate the fact that you are open about it, and I appreciate your honesty. May I ask you why?" And he says, "Well, we don't have any of these situations or events in our organization." And I said, "How many people are you responsible for when we talk about occupational safe and healthy?" And he said 60,000. And I said, "Well, I disagree with you. I do believe that you have a problem, and your problem is that people are not reporting. So you have a reporting problem. But if you have any population of 60,000 people, there's always a certain base rate of violent behavior." And I thought that was just horrible to have this individual in that role thinking that since I don't get any reports, this is not a problem in our company.
I think that's really interesting. And I've experienced similar things within some of the sporting associations in the UK, for instance, where it's almost a case of we don't want to go looking for problems where currently we don't think they exist. So let's kind of just keep a lid on it all. And certainly when I went into Parliament on the back of the Joe Cox assassination, one of the challenges we had there was lack of reporting. And in fact, by the time we got sort of mid-Brexit 2 years later, we'd gone up 400% in terms of reports. So they were always there. People just either just accepted it as part of the job, that's just what we have to put up with, or they didn't feel comfortable reporting it because it wasn't recognised and taken seriously. So I guess that's a common theme, and I'm sure that's continuing now.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and I think in the next AETAP webinar in 2 weeks. I think there's a presentation on why people are not reporting these situations. And I think that's still something that we definitely should be focusing on and thinking, why is it not happening? I mean, after school shootings, there was the U.S. Secret Service report on why students or parents or anybody else in that close proximity of the shooter hasn't reported, even though I think it was 80% of people in these cases had some sort of knowledge that something's going to happen. Yeah.
So I know COVID is an aspect that you're really focusing on, or have been focusing on the last couple of years, obviously from a different perspective to others. But before we move on to that side of it, are you hearing differences in how people are behaving, having been locked down for a period of time and now, if you like, being released back into the wild? Are we seeing differences around how people are behaving amongst each other, and how perhaps some of the etiquettes have broken down?
Well, there's been a number of really fascinating studies on overall resilience of individuals, organizations, or countries during COVID. And it seems to me that majority of people are resilient enough to cope with all the possible restrictions and life changes what they've been going through. But the thing what I always remind to people is that even though majority of people are managing the situation surprisingly well, the small percentage of people who are not coping well are just, they've had absolutely horrible 2 years. And I think since we are slowly, hopefully, moving into the endemic, we are going to see the euphoria of survival. It's all in the past. But I've been pleasantly surprised that we haven't seen as much and as many cases as I was expecting. Because now, bars are open and, people are moving about. And of course, street crimes, when people are moving about, street crimes should be going up and all that. But we're not at the end yet with the pandemic. So I keep on reminding people that don't talk about returning back to the time before COVID, because in our history, we never go back. Be prepared for time after COVID, and that's going to be a next change. So you're going to need resilience also when you're adapting into the new life form, whatever that is going to be. But the COVID era really, Finland being the happiest planet or country in the world 5 years in a row, during first year of COVID, we had an increase of more than 20% in narcotics crime, crimes against property, and violent crime. And in 2021, we had an increase of attempted homicides by 65% and homicide and murder by 75%. That's something that I still struggle to cope with. That's such a tremendous change, and unfortunately to the wrong way of increasing these violent crimes. So yeah, we haven't seen the end of COVID yet. And World Health Organization said in summer of 2021 that once the COVID pandemic ends, the next pandemic will start immediately, and that's the pandemic of mental health.
Right. So I can't remember what the situation is with Finland, but we are now in the UK certainly increasingly hearing stories about reluctance to return to work in terms of physically turning up in the office and what have you. And it strikes me, that that's where we're going to see some issues. We've already seen some issues around hostile employees or former employees who are targeting and causing problems with C-suite, etc., around either because they've been made redundant or they've lost their jobs, or because they're being forced back to a workplace where for some people who, arguably maybe introverts, etc., they were very comfortable working back in their own place and arguably were as productive, but now are being kind of forced back into an environment where they feel less comfortable, or actually it no longer suits their lifestyle.
Yeah.
What are we going to see around that, around risk and sort of threat behaviour?
Yeah, we've seen the same thing too with our clients, and I think that's a really fascinating question, because if there is no change in your productivity, or you're actually more productive in some cases, then what is the motive for the employer to physically have you back in the office? But we've seen, well, first of all, we've seen open conflict. So it's shouting, foul words, foul language, and just rude behavior. But we have also seen a slight increase in anonymous threats. But since the motive for threatening comes from within the company, they're relatively simple threats. So I would label those more still on venting out, instead of something that we would really start to look into targeted acts of violence. But yes, we have seen an increase in these cases here in Finland as well.
So let's talk about that then. So when you are called in because somebody is being venting, how do you then? What's the process you go through where you differentiate between that being venting as opposed to being a more concerning threat?
Well, it depends on the client, because we have three different options, and rarely we get to decide what will the actual service be. So it could be that we are simply called in to assess the threat and give a bunch of guidelines or recommendations on how to manage. And I call it a Band-Aid service, because some of our clients, they simply want that part. And then unfortunately, you don't have access to the case later on. So I think that some organizations, they want us to confirm their fears or validate their actions. And unfortunately, we don't know what the final result is of what they're doing. That's one service that we are quite frequently asked to do. On rare occasions, I actually get to meet an individual if we have a good idea of who this person might be. So we actually do interventions and interviews. I kind of like it. And knock on wood, I've never had anybody who would have been physically violent towards me. I understand venting. I understand that you are frustrated, but I have to say, every single time that I've met these individuals, I'm neutral. I'm here to get your side of the story, and I'm very transparent on who is actually paying for me to be there. So I haven't encountered any physical threats from these individuals. A little bit of harassment later on, some angry emails that were sent at 4 a.m. and that's it. And in some cases, we are only working with the possible target. So we're doing fear management, which is also something that I really, really like doing, perhaps because of the personal history that I mentioned that I had earlier. So rarely we have a client who kind of gives us an open invoice, so to say, do whatever you need to do and send us the bill. That's not part of the Finnish organizational culture, unfortunately.
So when you get into that conflict resolution stage, talk us through that then, because I know that's something that you specialise in. I know that you've got a new book coming up, which we'll talk about, around vexatious complainants, etc. So what is your model? What is your conflict resolution model?
Well, if we're talking about threats and if we're talking about targeted violence, then first you need to know what the case is all about. So as much information as you can absorb before the meetings, because you might be encountering claims that might not be true at all, or individuals might only share limited bits and pieces of information, what is beneficial for them. So knowing the background, then one of the things is also to make sure that the area where you are meeting these individuals is safe for you. But also what I like to do is I like to meet you at your home. If that makes sense from a security perspective, because you get so much information on that and people are more relaxed. So you might have a possibility to have a more honest behavior and communication when they are not intimidated by the surrounding environment or individuals. As said, so I'm very transparent. I'm a big believer of listening, active listening, bits and pieces of motivational interviewing, depending on the case. And as mentioned, I'm there. My primary goal is first to make sure that the individual feels that they have been listened to. And it's been many years, and I think I've paid my dues in managing your own behavior, but I'm sticking to my professional role. I don't have anything against you, and hopefully they don't have anything against me. So being a neutral listener, using empathy as much as possible, and as said, bits and pieces of motivational interviewing, gently trying to find out other solutions and suggesting other solutions that would help them save face, but also keep our client free of harassment or overall safe from any sort of physical or mental violence.
So how would you define then the difference between that and mediation?
Well, for me, as if I'm talking about mediation is more, should I say, it has a tighter structure. But it could be that me being non-native English speaker, I'm interpreting the word mediation differently than what you are using. But for mediation is more, it's like a trade action that we're trying to gain something through negotiations. And for me, it's more on dealing with the emotional state of the individual and calming down that individual and helping them.
So you've spoken, and you're widely known as someone that operates not just in Europe, but as you've mentioned in Southeast Asia and that part of the world. There must be huge cultural differences between those two parts of the world and way that people deal with shame, with people do with conflict and hierarchy and all those sort of things. Yeah, talk us through that. Then, how do you manage those different issues?
Well, I think the biggest issue in Southeast Asia, if I am dealing with people who are from the region, is that I'm not from the region. So, for example, I have a friend who's a captain with Cathay Pacific, has lived in Hong Kong for 30 years, speaks fluent Cantonese. His wife is from Hong Kong. And we had a talk many years ago about passengers who, mainly first class or business class passengers, who are not keen on using seatbelt or whatever, and the plane cannot take off. And my friend was telling me that with 30 years experience from the culture, being fluent in Cantonese, and he speaks Cantonese to a local individual, you're still a Guaylo. You're still, you don't understand. Yeah, and go away. So the biggest issue that I have to deal with if I'm in Indonesia or Vietnam or mainland China or India, I'm not local. But it can also be a benefit for me because I am not local. So there's two sides. Either you are not being respected, and whatever they say to you is simply, it's just a small talk. They want to get rid of you. Or you might have an authority to influence their behavior. I'm not a big fan of authority. I don't believe into conflict resolution with the help of authority, because usually you only get, there's a Matt Watkinson, an American author on customer service. He talks about surface issues and shadow issues. And usually surface issues are the ones that we're dealing with, and we rarely get access to the shadow issues. So the things that are somewhere deep inside our minds, our biases and fears and whatever. But that being said, I could be using authority. But as you said, in Asia, the role of saving your face goes much deeper and further than what we would do in a Western culture. So I'm trying to do my homework as much as possible, and I'm trying to talk with colleagues and local managers before meeting these individuals on trying to find ways that what they would consider being a face-saving gesture, something that we could suggest to them and kind of work our way to the goal. The other one is the role of family. So I rarely expect these individuals to make it, especially with younger individuals, people under the age of 40, even under 50. You're still living with your parents or with a larger group of your family. And you have to understand a person that the person of interests, their position in that society or subgroup in that family. Are they going to be able to make a decision right there and then? Is it something that they might want to discuss with their family? Or should I talk with the family, with the oldest of the family or older brother, or in some cultures with the mother, if I'm being granted an access to? But if it's sometimes difficult here in Europe, then it's definitely more difficult in Asia. And one of the compromises that you have to do is that you are not actually meeting these individuals at all. You are simply bringing your past experience and your, unfortunately, very Western approach to the topic, and giving that advice to the local and just kind of pushing them and helping them to solve it. When I was a negotiator for the police, very often the local police would already be in contact with the perpetrator. And when you would arrive there with your team, you would listen to what they're talking through the loudspeaker, and you would realize that actually this officer has already a very good rapport with the perpetrator. So why on earth would we jump in and ruin that what he or she has already been able to achieve? So the only thing you end up doing is you're writing notes to a piece of paper and saying, emphasize this and go there. And that's something you sometimes have to do in Asia with the clients.
In terms of the subjects of targeted attacks and predatory behaviour and the various indicators and linguistics and all that we know about, do they translate in terms of working in different parts of the world? Is that just human behaviour? Are we all the same, if you like?
Well, again, that's a really excellent question, because the basic elements of aggression and violence are universal. But, for example, using any of the assessment tools that we're using in the West, I'm very, very careful in using these tools in Asian setting. I mean, the Singapore Home Office has, I think they've done wonderful work with the testing of the current threat assessment tools in an Asian culture, an Asian setting. But that's pretty much the only country that I'm aware of that is doing this in Asia. Unfortunately, not even Hong Kong. So I would be very, very careful in taking the tools or the policies or strategies that we've been using for the past 20 years and assuming they work. And that's also, I think that's one of the positive challenges that you meet, because every single case is a learning experience for you. So you just proceed with caution.
And I also would imagine that you would agree that that's where the wider threat assessment professional community, in terms of the AETAPs and the various communities around the world, African and what have you, that's the real benefit of those organisations and those connections and networks, that they will know their local cultures and communities and what works and what doesn't work, and the kind of idiosyncrasies of all that. And that's one of the powerful elements, really, of the TAP network around the world.
I many years ago, I was in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, with my family, and I forgot my mobile phone into the taxi that we were using, but I had a receipt. And I realized that my phone is missing quite soon after we came to the hotel. And I went to the concierge, and the concierge called the number, and the taxi driver responded. He picked up the phone, and they were speaking in local dialect. And after the call was over, the concierge said that, I'm very sorry, but I was not able, and he was talking about himself, I was unable to reach an agreement with this individual because, and I'm not going to say the ethnic groups that we're talking about here, but they were both speaking Malay, but they were from different ethnic groups. And the concierge said, well, let's try this. Our bellboy is from the same ethnic group. So the bellboy gives a call. And because that ethnicity and culture connection with the taxi driver and the bellboy was the same, he was able to convince the taxi driver to come back, and being rewarded for the money for the phone, of course. But I think that's a good example on how deep these cultural issues are. Now, if you take this into a threat assessment or threat management case, and me going into a situation, you have to be very humble, and you have to be keen on hearing what your local resources are saying. You can only bring in so much and hope that we find a connection with the team that is helping you.
Yeah. And I think we probably underestimate that within the European context. We think, we're all, whether it's at Brexit, we're all Europeans and we're all pretty much the same. We don't necessarily recognise the huge differences in cultures, and maybe we're seeing that now, in the kind of Ukraine-Russian scenario there, but it's certainly something I think we underestimate. So listen, you've got a new book coming out. Talk about that. What's that book about?
Well, the book, I'm one of the authors. Taina Parviainen, another Finn, is the other author, and it's about managing complaints. And Taina is talking about overall the process of dealing with various types of somewhat challenging individuals and cases. And my part goes on to talk about vexatious complaints and how do you prevent these cases of becoming vexatious complainants. And like we all know, you cannot always prevent these cases. Then how do you manage them, and how do you make sure that your team has the best possible individuals to solve the case if it is possible, and how to respond to various claims and demands what these individuals are posing.
Because vexatious complaints are, and in terms of the actual complaint, but also court cases are a pattern sometimes within the fixated world, where that's one of the ways that they play out that fixation is by consistently keeping you engaged through these malicious complaints, through these court cases, which of course, can have huge issues for the recipient of that complaint, who the anxiety levels, the feeling of injustice, all those various different challenges that go on. But that's quite a common thing amongst the community of fixated individuals.
Well, I'll tell you two very recent cases. We were approached by an organization that has had a vexatious complainant now since 1999. And now, during the last year, 3 of their staff members resigned because they simply cannot endure. And hats off for them. This case has been going on for 2 decades. And now 3 people resigned, and we sent them a proposal, what our services include and how we would be managing it. And our point of contact in this organization said, well, you're going to have 3, because we're going to have a psychologist, a lawyer, and myself taking over the case. And this person says, well, it sounds very expensive. And I couldn't help myself thinking, well, hold on. 20 years of complaints and you've just lost 3 staff members. How expensive do you imagine we are? Because I think that's a lot of money during 20 years. And then shame on the city where I live in right now. And this is a message to the city of Espoo. They've had a swim hall. We've had a member of the society or the city who had a paper ticket of 10 entries into the local swim hall. And the city of Espoo, almost 10 years ago, changed the system into an electronic one. And he still had 9 visits unused. And he made a complaint, and the city of Espoo says, tough luck, you need to buy an electronic one. This case has been going on for almost 10 years now. And so if we have vexatious complainants who are fixated, I think the city of Espoo has city officials who are fixated instead of saying, let's just give this man the 9 tickets.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, it from the outside, it's so obvious, isn't it? But when you're kind of entrenched in that conflict and not wishing to give either side, the more entrenched you get, the difficult it is to back down, and the more ridiculous when you look at it from the outside perspective. Interesting. We've got a huge trial here between, it's very well known, between 2 footballers' wives, Wayne Rooney's wife and Vardy's wife, who are in conflict around whether one was leaking, private information about the other on social media, etc. So they're now at the High Court in London, spending millions on trying to prove who's right and wrong, neither wishing to give anything. But again, everyone's saying from the outside, well, you could put all those millions of pounds to really good use for some sort of other charity thing and actually just kind of have a coffee and sort it out or something, or have some mediation or something. But people get so entrenched in their views and their positions that it becomes impossible to kind of step back from that.
Yeah. You are so true. Well, so right. I absolutely agree with you. There's a number of cases coming to my mind as you're sharing the story. So,
30 years experience. What's the future of threat assessment? Where are we moving towards in the sort of next decade? Would you say?
I think what we will be seeing throughout Europe and hopefully throughout Asia as well is threat assessment being recognized in a much more broader sense than just something what either a police unit or a psychologist or a psychiatrist or Department of Corrections is doing. So I think threat assessment and prevention of targeted violence will become a norm, but we're still obviously not there yet. The other thing that has already started to happen in different countries in Europe is understand how powerful way it is when you have multidisciplinary teams, a broad variety of expertise, putting together their resources and literally figuring out more positive ways to prevent or manage violent behavior. I think those are the two main things that have already started to happen, but are not, they haven't blossomed yet as I would like to see.
What's your thoughts on the kind of automation of some of the processes?
Okay, I do understand what the word automation means, but what is in your mind?
Well, in terms of a lot of what we do is human analysis, if you like, but actually moving that onto AI or other formats where you're looking for the computers or the AI to identify indicators, identify risk.
I think we should work hand in hand, because what we do know is that, for example, I've read a few studies where computers are actually making better diagnosis of illnesses than doctors, because they have no emotions. They are simply looking at the data. But then again, there is a risk what type of data is in the system. I did a presentation a few years ago in Belgium on threat assessment and AI, but with a slightly different perspective. It was more on impulsive violence and all that. And one of the things what I pointed out is that a lot of these systems that are mainly used in US, but we have systems in Germany and the Netherlands, and I'm not sure. I don't remember if there was a system that was in the UK as well. But the issue is that a lot of these systems are using data that you get from the police. That's already biased.
Yeah.
Because, for example, if you're using a system, I'm not sure if you can hear our dog now, but for example, if you're using AI to detect narcotics crime in the city, well, the police mainly arrest users that are in low income areas and suburban areas where you don't need a computer to pick up a dealer on the street. If that's all the data that you input into the system, then the system is only reinforcing what you already know. So to answer your question, I think I am interested and keen on looking what the systems will bring, but working hand in hand. I wouldn't completely move bits and pieces of my work to a computer, but I wouldn't want to do it by myself either if there is a system that is available.
So we're coming towards the end. I just wanted, talk us a little bit about Peace of Mind, your company.
Well, there's two companies, one Peace of Mind in Finland and one Peace of Mind in Asia, in Hong Kong. Our Finnish company has been around since 1998. And we're a micro company with 8 employees, and we specialize on the topics that we've been discussing, conflict resolution and threat assessment and threat management. And same thing in Asia, we've been around since 2010. Oddly enough, here in Finland, most of our work is around workshops, and about 10-15% are about cases. And in Asia, it's completely the opposite. So most of our work is cases, and only a small percentage is workshops. because our clients are slightly different in these two continents.
So what I'll do is we'll attach the links that I know you sent me to the podcast, so that anyone who wants to get in touch with you, Totti, can do so. And really, just for me, it's an opportunity to say huge thank you. It's been riveting chatting with you, and really, this podcast is all around getting the masters of their craft online to share their expertise and experience, and you've done exactly that. So thank you for that. And I look forward to meeting you hopefully later this year in London when we're both speaking at the Security Expo.
Well, I will be at the expo. I just don't know if I'm speaking, but I already have the dates on my calendar, so good. I will be there.
Good, we'll see you there then. That's 27th and 28th September, I believe.
And I'm coming to watch the finals of the Gallagher rugby.
Oh,
in June.
Okay.
So
get in touch. Yeah, definitely. Well, Totti, thank you so much, and once again, thank you to all our listeners to the Online Bodyguard. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Online Bodyguard podcast with host Philip Grindell, CEO and founder of Defuse. Please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcasting platforms.